Perfect. Heather, do you want to wait a couple more minutes or should we start?
I think we're good to go. Yeah.
Great. All right. Okay, I will start us off. Welcome, everyone. We're so grateful to have you all here today for the book launch of Jessica Hernandez's book, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science. We encourage you to check out the book if you haven't already. And again, are so grateful to be able to have her here today. I'm Heidi Kiwetnipinisik Stark. I'm the director of the Center for Indigenous Research and Community-Led Engagement, and was graciously invited by Heather to help co-sponsor this event, and really commend Heather for all the amazing work she's put together organizing the event. So to open, we've asked Elder Barb Hume to give us some opening words to start us off in a good way. And we're so grateful to have her here with us today. Métis Elder Barb Hume has deep connections to the Métis communities in British Columbia and Manitoba. She was born in Selkirk, Manitoba, in the heart of the Métis Nation's Red River settlement, and is an active member of the Victoria Métis community. And after earning a diploma and a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, Barb entered the Canadian Armed Forces, where she rose to the rank of major. She's often called upon to represent Indigenous veterans at ceremonies and on committees. And after retiring in Victoria, she became one of the founding members of the Métis Nation Greater Victoria and has served in such roles as administrator, historian, citizenship coordinator, and genealogy advisor. And Barb has been involved in UVic's Elders Voices program for more than 3 years. So we're just so grateful, Barb, to have you here with us today, in addition to all the great work you do for the UVic community and the Greater Victoria community. So I'll just turn it over to you. And Miigwech, so much for being here.
Oh, we've got to just work on the mic there. Hector,
we're good. And as Heidi said, my name is Barb Hume, and I, at this time, would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples, whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. I too have been a visitor on these lands for the last 30 years, and for every day I feel grateful and thank the Lekwungen people for the opportunity to be here. I also express acknowledgement and respect for the peoples and the lands for each one of us are joining today, and say thank you. I would like to thank the Creator for this opportunity to hear the stories of Indigenous people through the work of Dr. Hernandez. I ask for their thoughts and words to be heard, and the thoughts and words of our ancestors as well. I ask that the words and the work be respected, that the wisdom be humbly and gratefully forwarded to others, that honesty and courage continue, and that the truth and love that Indigenous people have for the land, water, and air, and all that are part of it, are recognized as historic stewards of our shared world. I look forward to hearing what Dr. Hernandez has to share, and I hope that each one of us recognize that we have a responsibility in the care of Mother Earth, and that our ancestors can help guide us in this most important journey. Thank you.
thank you so much, Barb, for that warm words for us to ground ourselves in the place that I'm also in, the Lekwungen speaking territories, and maybe for everybody else to just think for a moment about where you are, and if it's in your homelands, feeling that good feeling of being there, and for those who are visitors in other places to recognize whose territories you're on. I'm new to Lekwungen territories. I've only been at the University of Victoria for just over 6 months now. But it's been the best 6 months, I can say, in a long while. And one of the things that made it so special coming here was to connect with Circle, the Center for Indigenous Research and Community-Led Engagement. I've known about Circle for a really long time. I was a postdoc at University of Victoria, so it's really exciting to be back and to be connecting with such a warm community of folks there. So I'm really glad that we could co-host this event, Heidi, very much. I met Jessica Hernandez on Twitter, and I follow a lot of folks, and I came across Jessica's, Dr. Hernandez's Twitter feeds and got really excited about this young Indigenous scientist and the messages that she was articulating for herself, for her people, for Indigenous peoples around the world, around the importance of Indigenous knowledge systems. And so I started following her and found out she was publishing this new book called Fresh Banana Leaves. And I was immediately drawn to it and wanted to be one of the first in line to say, come and talk about your book with our community here at the University of Victoria. And I was so delighted that she was able to say yes. We really wanted this to be in person. I'm sure everybody can relate to that because it's so good to be together with some good food and good energy and good spirit. But I think that we can also bring that to our Zoom community today. I'm going to give a formal bio so that I get as much as I can right. Dr. Hernandez is an Indigenous scholar, a scientist, a community advocate. She's based in the Pacific Northwest with an interdisciplinary academic background, ranging from marine sciences to forestry. Her work is grounded on her Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing that are rooted from El Salvador, the Maya Chorte, and Oaxaca, Mexico, the Zapotec. She advocates for food, climate, and environmental justice through her scientific and community work, and strongly believes that Indigenous sciences can heal our Indigenous lands. And I have to say, I'm a strong believer in that too. She was raised in South Central LA, and in 2020, she became the first alum from her high school to receive and complete a doctorate degree. Bravo. She is the founder of Pina Sol, an SPC, and I'm going to need you to tell me what SPC stands for, an environmental consulting and artisanias hybrid business that promotes and supports environmental sustainability and conservation among Black and Indigenous communities. And if you don't follow Dr. Hernandez yet on Twitter, then you may not know that she likes to melt her ice cream just a tiny little bit before having it. And that's just one of the fun facts about Dr. Hernandez. And I like my ice cream not so hard too, so I can really relate. It's a real pleasure to have you here, Jessica, if I may, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you. And we really look forward to hearing more about Fresh Banana Leaves and your academic journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, for the warm welcome, and also Elder Barb for also welcoming me to this space. So, Wendell Padichu Biguri, my name is Jessica Hernandez, and I'm excited to be presenting today about my book, Fresh Banana Leaves, as well as what is Indigenous science. So before I also start my virtual presentation, I would like to virtually acknowledge the lands where I'm presenting from. I'm presenting from the lands and shared waters of the Duwamish and Coast people, also known as Seattle, named after Chief Sealth. As a displaced Indigenous woman, one of the teachings that my grandmother instilled in me and passed down to me is that in order for us to start healing Indigenous landscapes, everyone must understand their positionality as either settlers, unwanted guests, or welcome guests. And that is ultimately determined by the Indigenous communities whose lands you currently reside or are occupied on. And I think that this is important for me to highlight, especially after giving a land acknowledgement, because I did come as an unwanted guest on Duwamish and Coast Salish territories. And I'm continuing to build those relationships with just not the Indigenous lands, but also the Indigenous peoples whose lands and home I'm currently residing on. I would also like to give this reminder that Indigenous peoples are not a monolith. We're all different based on our environments, knowledges, and cultures. And that is because we're grounded on place based values. I only speak on my indigeneity and my lived experiences. One of the grounding teachings that my book Fresh Banana Leaves embodies, and also all of my work as an Indigenous scientist, is that our environments carry our identities and histories. Our environment can carry also our trauma that can be traced to settler colonialism, where our ancestors were murdered, displaced, and forced to live under the Western European concepts of culture, science, and capitalism that still govern our current societies, as well as our healing. For me, as a Maya Chorti woman who has been displaced, it's important to also mention that that displacement is rooted on the settler governments that supported the Central American Civil War that, basically happened in Guatemala and El Salvador. This kind of forced our displacement, especially since this civil war was a genocide against indigenous Maya peoples. It forced our indigenous Maya children to fight in the war as child soldiers. And I think that, this is what grounds my roots, especially as a transnational and displaced indigenous woman who has Maya Chorti upbringings. Oftentimes, one of the questions that I'm always asked is like, why did I decide to write this book? I think that one of my main priorities was to tell my father's story. My father was 11 when he was forced to fight in the Central American Civil War that has been coined as a genocide by the United Nations today. Oftentimes, when we look at historical archives that kind of focus on the Central American Civil War, I didn't see any indigenous perspective or voices or stories uplifted in those historical archives. It's also important to center indigenous voices, as I mentioned, because this war, while it was coined as a civil war by the governments, it was actually a genocide carried against our people that targeted our indigenous Maya elders and our children. And that's why they were forced to fight as indigenous child soldiers in that war. As a climate scientist, it's important to mention how we view climate science, right? Because oftentimes in the sciences, especially in climate science, we forget to link displacement and also the impacts that climate change has on people. An example that I also want to give is how we view restoration. Restoration teaches us that in order to conserve a landscape, we must get rid of all the invasive species that are known as weeds. Yes, invasive species harm an entire ecosystem, sometimes outcompeting all native plants in the same landscapes. But as an indigenous scientist, and I want to, thank the First Nation scholars who coined this term 2I we are trained in the Western sciences, but we still carry the indigenous knowledge, that traditional ecological knowledge that I refer to as indigenous science, to view even this concept of invasive species, right? For many of us, and feel free to tell me whether this is a teaching that your community also holds, invasive species are displaced relatives. We are taught to aggressively remove them, especially when we're doing restoration work, but we often forget that, some of these invasive species are the people who are removing them, they're displaced relatives. And I think that this displacement that parallels the displacements of plants that we see in our landscapes today also parallels the displacement that many indigenous peoples have to undergo because of climate change and obviously political turmoil. Displacement is viewed as immigration, and under the settler governments of the United States and Canada, immigration is criminalized. Climate change is increasing the number of climate refugees. In It's estimated by by 2050, 200 to a billion people are going to be displaced due to climate change. And I think that it's important to also mention that many of my communities are still facing this displacement because of their ongoing kind of repercussions and trauma that this genocide that I mentioned is oftentimes labeled as a civil war had on our people and has on our people. Oftentimes, as Indigenous peoples, we're told to kind of get over genocide because that's something that happened in our past. But for me, especially for many Indigenous Maya people, this genocide can be traced to our parents and our grandparents' generation. So it wasn't that long ago. I also want to mention the deaths that we are experiencing from our Indigenous Maya children because of this criminalization that happens when they're displaced. I want to read a quote, a passage that was published in Freshman Annalise that kind of talks about that displacement and how it has led to the deaths of many of our Indigenous Maya children. So I want to also give a content warning. Since December 2018, there have been at least 5 Maya children and 1 young Maya woman who have died in the United States, US-Mexico border under US custody or killed by federal officials. Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez, Maya Mom Nation, 20 years old, was shot in the head by a Customs and Border Patrol agent in Texas on May 23rd, 2018, after crossing the border. Jacqueline Calma King, Maya Quechua Nation, 7 years old, died of a bacterial infection on December 8, 2018. Felipe Gomez Alonso, Maya Chu Nation, 8 years old, died on Christmas Eve, 2018 of flu complications. Juan de Leon Gutierrez, Maya Chorti Nation, from my community, 16 years old, died on April 30th, 2019 from a brain infection caused by an untreated sinus infection. Wilmar Josue Ramirez Vasquez, Maya Chorti Nation, 2.5 years old, died of pneumonia on May 16, 2019. Carlos Gregorio Hernandez Vasquez, Maya Achi Nation, 16 years old, died on May 20, 2019 after an influenza A diagnosis. So I think that it's important for us to mention that Indigenous peoples continue to face displacement, especially external displacement, internal displacement, which happens within our borders because of climate change and the ongoing settler colonialism that rings our countries. There are over 500 years of displacement and genocide and death that is embedded in our history and trauma. Forced displacement is not just from the 2014 or the 1980s, right, when the Civil War genocide happened. As a climate scientist, we can, I can talk about how global average temperatures are rising, but oftentimes because of climate science and how it's very data driven, we forget to also incorporate climate justice and the intersectionalities it has with Indigenous peoples. When we talk about climate change and Indigenous peoples, we can point to the 5 inequities that I would like to highlight on this presentation. Inequity 1 is a degree of responsibility for climate change. Inequity number 2, the impact of climate change in the global south. Inequity number 3, the ability and capacity to deal with the impacts of climate change. Inequity number 4, the intergenerational impacts of climate change. And inequity number 5, the gender disparities of climate change. So as a climate scientist, we often forget to include the Indigenous perspectives, the Indigenous knowledges, and lived experiences. And this is because climate science follows the Western science approach, right? Where we state a problem, formulate a hypothesis, design an experiment, collect data, analyze that data, and draw conclusions. As we can see, Western science tends to be very binary. It follows a linear method. It is also reductionary. And, when we look at the founders of many of the major STEM disciplines, they're not Indigenous peoples, right? They're European cisgender men who came and kind of introduced some of the notions that we know as sciences. For Indigenous peoples, we continue to be viewed as research subjects, and our communities are also areas of expertise. And I think I wanted to kind of also highlight this quote that, was published in Teen Vogue that I mentioned. We're often seen as areas of expertise rather than the experts ourselves. And I think that it's important for us to bring to light these nuances that, as Indigenous peoples, we are our experts of our own lived experiences. We are the experts of our own knowledge. And we're also seen as research subjects rather than researchers, right? And I think that it's important for us to reflect on our positionality, especially when it comes to climate science and climate change, if we truly want to heal our Mother Earth and our planets as we undergo these climatic conditions. So what I refer to as indigenous science. So what I refer to indigenous science is knowledge that has been acquired through observation and analysis by indigenous communities since time immemorial. And these are some figures that kind of show what indigenous science is more holistic, right? Because if we were to compare it to the scientific method, it kind of follows the holisticness of what it means to be a human, what it means to be on this earth. At the core of our indigenous science is our spirituality, is the hope, is the emotions that make us humans. And of course, it's tied to our environments, animals, and other customs that make our cultures unique, especially in these times that have adapted right to modernization and colonialism as well. And I think that with indigenous science, we tend to look at the world in a different lens, more holistic than, what the sciences tend to do, which is to put things in boxes, right? In the Western sciences, if you want to study fish, you kind of pursue fisheries. And if you want to study animal biomechanics, you can pursue biomechanics. But through indigenous science, we looked at how everything's interconnected, from sociology to public health, because it's more of a holistic framework. Indigenous science relates to both the science knowledge of long resident, usually oral cultural peoples, as well as the science knowledge of those peoples who, as participants in culture, are affected by the worldview and interests of their home communities. And that's what I refer as indigenous science. So when we look at climate science, as I was mentioning, we do not have discussions, or we don't formulate much data on the displacement that many indigenous peoples are facing. And why I focus on external displacement, because that's a part of my lived experiences. Indigenous peoples are also facing internal displacements, where they're being displaced within their own, the settler borders, from usually from rural areas to cities, right? And that's as a result of climate change and other layers. Obviously, we cannot talk about indigenous science or climate change without mentioning colonization. So we all know that colonization, right, was coined, or was kind of in a way allowed for it to happen by this term known as manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is a phrase coined in 1845, which is the idea that the United States is destined by its Western God, to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. And obviously, because of colonization, there were so many layers that were introduced into our communities, into our lands. One of those layers was the removal of indigenous communities, especially from the environmental discourse, where we used to be original stewards and caretakers of our environments. And now we don't even have a seat at the table where environmental policy or management practices are being ratified or are being discussed by politicians and policymakers. We also saw the notion of the pristine myth, where our nature and environments were viewed as pure wilderness and unspoiled, while removing that connection that humans had with nature, especially when it came to storing those environments that colonizers and settlers view as pristine. And when we talk about indigenous science, it's kind of hard to ignore the fact that our indigenous science was fractured, right? As somebody who is in the field of physics now, I can see how many physicists are trying to unravel the mysteries, as they call it, of how our ancestors, especially Mayan ancestors, right, like their Mayan civilizations, were able to build pyramids. And it makes me question how our indigenous science would have been advanced if we didn't face colonization. We also have the stereotype of the ecological noble savage. And I think that as an indigenous person, especially in environmental sciences, I have to walk a fine line between amplifying this stereotype because it creates more harm. And this is a stereotype of how indigenous peoples were portrayed during colonization, where we were portrayed as these mystical creatures that were prancing and dancing in nature, that had, this strong relationship with nature, because colonization also fracture some of our relationships with nature, especially if we're displaced. And I often say that, I have to walk a fine line to balance my relationships as an indigenous scientist to not amplify the stereotypes of ecological knowledge. And, if you ask me how I do that, it's kind of hard to kind of say how I do it, right? Because it's like always a balancing act. And when we talk about conservation, I think it's one of the main focus of this book. I always tell people that, many of our indigenous languages, at least my languages, don't have a word for conservation. And I think that's because when we look at our relationships with nature, we were never trying to just protect one species or protect one landscapes. We have words that kind of translate to healing or protecting. And I think that, that's why I believe that when we look at indigenous science and how we view our environments, especially in the era of climate change, we're trying to heal them and protect them from further degradation. I really like these pictures because it kind of shows the contradiction of manifest destiny, right? Where we introduce extractive energy sources, fossil fuels, dim ships to extract from our lands versus indigenous science, we view it more as healing, right? Where we're storing their lands, where we're taking only what we need and not depending so much on that extractive energy sources. And when we talk about the nexus or the intersection of colonialism and our environments and ecology, I would like to also pinpoint to this term that I refer to as eco-colonialism. And eco-colonialism for me has three layers. The first layer is that non-indigenous peoples are governing over our natural resources and indigenous lands without consulting indigenous peoples of those lands or respecting indigenous sovereignty. The second layer is the severe altering of our landscapes due to settler colonialism and the ideologies it introduced, including climate change impacts. The third layer is the lack of resources offered to indigenous or communities of color who are already experiencing the impacts of climate change that often results in displacement, right? And I also bolded displacement because it kind of wraps my story and also my healing journey as a displaced indigenous woman, especially whose father and his generation experienced genocide. So I think that I strongly believe, right, that as for us to truly heal our indigenous landscapes and environments, which are all indigenous lands, right? Because oftentimes we forget that we must incorporate indigenous voices, perspectives, and lived experiences. And I hope this presentation kind of gave you an overview of, the discussions that I hope to have today and also the book. So thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was really great, and I wish the whole room could applaud. So if you've got your mouse handy, and you can put a little clap on there, just to show our appreciation for Jessica's commitment to her work, to bringing Indigenous science to the masses, if you will, through her book, Fresh Banana Leaves, and to get us to start thinking a little bit differently around what it means to be displaced, and to think about invasive species in a new way, with respect to what that means with fresh banana leaves. So we have time for questions to Jessica, and we welcome those from the group. There's a large group of us. I can't see everybody's screen, so it's okay to just turn off your mic and try speaking while we're waiting for people to formulate questions, or if you prefer to write them in the chat, I can read them out as well. So I'll just take a minute to see who's going to be brave enough to ask that first question. And if not, I know that Heidi and I have a bunch and maybe some other people do too. But we definitely would love to hear from students and students of all ages. I know we're all lifelong learners. So I see Marian's got her hand up. Marian, would you be able to unmute and then go for it?
I hadn't thought of this in quite some time until this wonderful Dr. Jessica Hernandez brought it back to my thought. But decades ago, when I was a student in Mexico, that I got so interested in the ejido system, as it was called, and it meant that many indigenous villages and communities that had commonly shared lands that they looked after, and in recent times, I haven't heard anything about how it's being perpetuated in Mexico and elsewhere. And I wonder if Dr. Hernandez could inform us whether she's familiar with the system and whether it's considered adaptable in creative ways in many different regions as a way of honoring respect for the land and, as you say, caring for it.
Thank you, Marion. I'll get you to mute the mic and we'll turn it back over to Jessica.
Yes, thank you for your question. And for those who don't know what ejidos mean, it's just very similar, and it's the same premises of when a community kind of communally stewards a land and kind of has ownership of the land, and as a community as opposed to just one private citizen. And yes, we still practice. Many of our communities practice ejidos, especially in Central America. One of the reasons why we don't practice it as much is because our lands were stolen, right? And they were sold in large quantities through land grabs to international corporations that introduced the monocultural systems of bananas being one of them, pineapples, avocados, and all of those things. So in Central America, we don't get to, practice ejidos as much. We do practice some of them in our smaller pueblos, but in Mexico, we still practice that. And I think it is in most of our ejidos, we have milpas, which are these holistic agricultural systems that kind of caretake that kind of care for themselves, where we don't have to put much human labor as Western agricultural systems. We have to. And I think that through that we can practice our ancestral knowledges of milpas. And I think that that's an example of how we have maintained the ejidos, especially that communally looking at the land through a communal lens rather than private ownership that Western colonialism kind of introduced to our lands. Thank you for your question.
Thanks so much, Jessica. There's another question in the chat from Diane Obed about just first thanking you for your important work. And if you could just share a little bit more for those, especially who haven't had a chance to read your book, why you chose the title, Fresh Banana Leaves.
Yeah, so there are many reasons why I chose the title Fresh Banana Leaves. One of them being that there are displaced plant species, right? That were introduced through these large plantations that kind of still, bought our lands in those land grabs, and they have become our displaced relatives, right? Because we incorporate them in our traditional foods and our traditional gatherings as well. And the second reason why I kind of, the main reason why I titled the book Fresh Banana Leaves was just based on a story that my father shared with me. So he was forced to join the guerrilla at the age of 11 because that was the age that they were recruiting little boys, especially given that, we had lost a lot of our men in both the, military, the army side, and as well as the community side. And at the age of 14, 3 years being in the guerrilla, his encampment was bombarded and it was attacked by the government. And one of the stories that he shared with me that, kind of has a teaching to it is that he will always play with this banana tree. He will always kind of hide with this, kind of hide from his reality in this banana tree. And during that bombardment, he went under this banana tree that he had built a relationship with. And he saw a bomb drop on top of the banana tree. But instead of the bomb igniting, he saw how the banana leaves wrapped the bomb where it prevented it from igniting, right? And while this story might seem like a dream or, surrealism, or it kind of seems different, mystical, right, in the Western lens, it kind of is grounded on the indigenous teaching that he taught me, that nature protects you as long as you protect nature. And I think that oftentimes, we say that, in the Western religion, we say that, oh, angels are protecting you. But my father taught me that, nature also protects us. There are plant species and animal relatives are also protecting us. And I think that it kind of embodies why I named it Fresh Banana Leaves, because it gave us a fresh start, especially, I wouldn't be here today if that banana tree hadn't protected my father from that bomb. And, it's kind of something that uplifts his story, especially the story that kind of pushed me to pursue the environmental sciences. Thank you for your question.
Thanks so much, Jessica. I see Joan Rousseau has her hand raised.
Yes, I'm just following up with after Marion's question. I was wondering if you'd comment on how NAFTA has affected the ejidos. I think I always thought it was some sort of an agreement to privatize the ejidos for NAFTA, and also the impact of the sale of corn from Canada, genetic corn from Canada and the US. I remember being there in 2008 with all the rallies saying, sin maíz no es país, and something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that has been, thank you for mentioning the indigenous movement against genetically modified, especially corn, right? Because maize tends, it's a relative for us. And in Oaxaca, we steward and caretake over 80 species of corn, right? Because we still have kind of sustained the biodiversity that we can find in corn. And I think that, NAFTA obviously allow for these international corporations to buy those lands through the land grabs and introduce those monocultural systems. And unfortunately, we still see a lot of those, bananas, avocados, pineapples being exported, especially to the US and Canada for consumption. And, that's something that our communities are still fighting against. And then also that coupled with climate change is also leading to the displacement of many of our people. And, we have witnessed, especially if you watch the news in the United States, a lot of our people are coming in caravans so that they can protect each other, especially as they go through the Mexican border as well as the US border, because they still face violence in their journeys. And I think that it's NAFTA and all these other corporations are added a layer to that displacement. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Jessica. A question from Claire Atwell. Can you speak to the tension between traditional governance structures and the governance structures imposed through colonization and globalization? Claire is especially interested in how this is being navigated in order to help generate the learning and cultural scaffolding that lifts up your Indigenous values.
I'm assuming traditional governance is relating to our Indigenous governance somehow, or?
That's my sense of it, yeah. And Claire, if you'd like to clarify.
Yeah, I just, I know that, in British Columbia, they set up tribal councils that really messed with traditional governance structures. And so what was maybe, it became very male oriented in decision making. And yeah, so, and that really messed with a whole way of decision making. And I'm just sort of wondering how you navigate that in order to lift up the values and the culture that you're wanting.
Yeah, thank you for your clarification. I think that oftentimes I think of the matriarchy that our Zapotec community still follows. It's not to say that our entire nation follows this, but at least in my maternal pueblo, we still follow the matriarchal structure where women are the leaders. Women, a man cannot speak until every woman in our community or, circle has spoken. And I think that that's kind of very opposite of patriarchy, right? And I think that, I can kind of don't know how our community, especially my pueblo, has been able to sustain that because, patriarchy is everywhere. So, that kind of relates to the fact that for many Indigenous communities, women were the leaders. And another thing that comes to mind is just the Zapatista movement, which was Indigenous women-led, where the Zapatistas in Chiapas, they're made up of different Indigenous Maya pueblos that make up the nation, kind of decided to rebel against the government where they were tired of not necessarily receiving aid or not being supported by the government structures. So they decided to take over Chiapas, especially that region. And instead of, and, the government just allowed them because, they were equipped with, kind of like a guerrilla. And I think that, that was a way for the Zapatistas to kind of reclaim their lands and their communities under those colonial structures. So, I always bring that example up because, when we talk about Zapatistas, the person who's, given the voice is, a cisgender man, Comandante Marcos, but that was entirely an indigenous woman-led movement to kind of reclaim their lands and also reclaim their traditional governments. And they still practice that today. The Mexican government doesn't have any say or any jurisdiction in their lands. And, I think that in Canada, a lot of First Nations also try to model after the Zapatistas.
Thank you
for
so
your question.
much.
Thank you. We have a question from Dwight Owens, just to get you to elaborate a little bit about the current state of war and genocide in your homelands today.
Yeah, so recently we had the Maya Cree community kind of actually do a resistance movement against a Canadian mining company that was desecrating our lands. The Canadian government actually provided the Guatemalan government with military equipment where they were throwing like gas, they were doing other, violent atrocities against our people, especially our indigenous women, because it was again an indigenous woman led, peaceful resistance against a Canadian mining company that, was displacing them and also forcing them to work under these, harsh conditions that the mining industry follows. And I think that for many of our people, it kind of resurfaces the war trauma, right, that they had because, a lot of, my parents' generations fought in those wars. They were involved in that genocide. So I think that is resurfacing the trauma. And we are also seeing how, Canada and the United States continue to play a role in, those ongoing wars or those ongoing struggles that our people, especially Indigenous Maya people, are trying to combat against. Thank you for your question.
Thanks. Thanks, Jessica. Lawrence Ignace has a question around your use of the term Indigenous science and is wondering whether you see any risk in using the term Indigenous science as compared to Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous knowledge systems, and that in many instances you would typically use the actual Indigenous name or term of the community or nation. So in the context of here, Coast Salish knowledge or Lekwungen knowledge here in this territory versus Indigenous. And just wondering if you could tease out a little bit the thought processes you had around using science versus knowledge or knowledge systems. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that I use the term Indigenous science because I was trained as a scientist. Like I was trained as an engineer, especially given the privilege of pursuing higher academia. And when I look at how science is taught and how science is formulated, it's very similar to how our Indigenous knowledge is formulated. I'm not trying to speak for all Indigenous peoples, and I think that's why I added that disclaimer, right, that I can only speak for my lived experiences. But I think that it's up to the community. One of the reasons why I don't like to use the term traditional ecological knowledge is because scientists tend to focus more on the traditional side of things, where they continue to speak on about our people or our knowledges in the past tense. So I try to use Indigenous science for that reason. I also use Indigenous science because I have witnessed how our knowledge systems have adapted. And oftentimes people think that, we are still stuck in the past. And I think that through that training as a scientist, I cannot separate my indigeneity from the science I practice. And that's why I use the term Indigenous science. But in terms of the negative, I guess the risk is that, I hope that people don't assume that every Indigenous person refers to their knowledge systems as Indigenous science. That's just a personal choice for myself. Thank you for your question.
That's great. Thank you, Jessica. Keep the questions coming, folks. I can read them out in the chat, or if you have them and you want to raise your hand, feel free to do that as well. I see Trevor Hancock has his hand raised. Go ahead, Trevor.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. I'm not sure this is exactly, if you like, a science question, but I'm working with a couple of groups that are looking at how we develop land use policies in this region, in the Greater Victoria region, that and how those land use policies for an already urbanized area take into account the wishes of Indigenous people, and whether you've seen any examples of how that's best done. So as we go forward, we want to create a more sustainable, more just region. To do that through changes to the built environment. These lands have already been taken. There was just a very interesting presentation the other day called to share, about a book called to share not surrender. So Indigenous people here didn't actually surrender the land in the so-called treaties that in any case appear to have been almost entirely fraudulent, but to share the land. But in practice, our land use policies don't do that. So we don't have any answers. We're just struggling with that question right now. How does one do that? And I wonder if you'd seen any examples or had any thoughts about where that's being done at all, never mind well.
Thank you for your question. I cannot think of any examples, but like if the audience has some examples that they're willing to share, I'm trying to think. If something comes to mind, I will probably let you know. So,
That's a great idea. If there are other examples that people in the group can think of, maybe bring them to our attention, particularly Trevor.
But just more generally, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that challenge.
and the challenge being, can you repeat that challenge?
How one moves forward land use planning in already urbanized areas in a way that takes into account the Indigenous people whose lands they were.
I think, yeah, I think your question kind of makes me think of the land back movement, right? Where a lot of Indigenous peoples are leading the movement so that they can get some of their land back. And obviously, when we hear the land back movement, people oftentimes assume that, you know, we're trying to deport everyone who's not Indigenous or kind of expel them from the country. But with the land back movement, it's just, in a way, it's ingrained in allowing Indigenous peoples from those regions to steward their lands, to advocate for the protection of their lands, because oftentimes these management practices, especially in conservation or in urban planning, right, it kind of conflicts with Indigenous ways of living. For instance, working in conservation, especially in urban parks, Indigenous peoples are not allowed to harvest their native plants or their medicinal plants because, you know, it's city property. And I often see that, especially in urban planning, right, how sometimes the regulations that are in place in urban settings kind of conflict or do not necessarily embody what Indigenous peoples kind of still practice. And I think that given that, you know, many cities, we have, you know, a lot of Indigenous peoples, urban Indigenous peoples, maybe we can see how urban planning can, in a way, coexist with Indigenous rights and values, and not, you know, in this case, like not being able to harvest or, you know, get any of those plants from an urban park is kind of, you know, sometimes the only way that Indigenous peoples have access to those medicinal plants, especially in the urban setting as well. I hope that kind of addressed some of the questions. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Jessica. There's a somewhat similar question, but I'm going to put a little different spin on it from Tricia Mark, who first just wants to thank you for sharing your work with us. And she looks forward to reading the rest of your book. She's begun with the intro and the first chapter. There's lots of questions. One question that she has is just around community engaged or community led work that involves academic institutions, student researchers, established researchers. If you've seen any that really foster the kind of two-eyed seeing that's needed, like really authentically between universities and communities, to help us rethink our current approaches to the field or disciplines in the areas of things like ecological restoration. You know, what are some of the examples that you could sort of shine a light on and say, this is what we're talking about, people?
Yeah, I think that many of us in academia, right, kind of have used this approach of community-based participatory research or community-based projects, like not holistically, right? Where we decide what the project is, we decide what the research question is without even consulting the indigenous communities that we're trying to work with in the planning process, right? They kind of become an afterthought. So we are in, like, probably in step 3, and we're like, oh, let's make this community based. Let's, get consultation or get some indigenous voices in the discussion. And I think that one of the best ways to do that is that instead of us formulating these questions, especially as scientists or environmental scientists, where we're taught to make up a question and then find the data and do the research, we can ask the communities what kind of questions will benefit them. I know that oftentimes building those relationships takes a long time, but I think that that kind of fosters a different approach of how we view community based, especially in the sciences, right? Where it doesn't just mean that you integrated voices, you actually integrated the voices before you took on step 1, right? It was just a planning process, creating the whole project. And that's something that I try to do. And obviously, that kind of slows down the research, because, oftentimes in the sciences, right, we're taught to kind of work fast, especially in academic settings where you're trying to get tenure, getting more grants, you're kind of layering so many research projects onto one project. But I think that, asking the community what they can benefit from, especially given some of the resources that we have because of being affiliated to the university, will be a great way to start shifting or redefining what we really mean by community-based, whether it be participatory research or community-based projects. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. It sounds like the key message there is don't start something and then bring it to a community. It needs to start in the community, with the community at the get-go. I see Joan Rousseau has her hand up again. Joan?
Yes, I was wondering if you could comment on what Pemex did to the Olmec civilization. I couldn't believe how, when I went there to see it, at night we got there and there were all Pemex was everywhere, and the large heads from the Olmec were moved away from the pyramidal event and so on. I wonder if you could expand on that, because here climate change is also not only impacted on humans and animals, but certainly on heritage.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And Pemex is just like the BP, right, for Mexico, where it's like this big oil company that, Mexico as a country nation relies on. And I think that, yes, a lot of the oil drilling tends to happen in sacred sites. And while indigenous communities try to advocate for that, we often see that with the pipelines, oftentimes there isn't any kind of justice brought to our communities, right? And unfortunately, yes, we did lose a lot of our sacred sites, artifacts like the Olmec, stoneheads, because they decided to drill in that location and obviously destroy those sacred sites to the Olmec people. Thank you for bringing that example up.
Thanks, Jessica. I see there's a note in the chat from Claire Atwell of a current example that she brings to our attention by Nathalie Chambers of Madrona Farm, who ceded her farm back to the local indigenous community, but with an established relationship of being caretakers using permaculture. So it's a different approach. They're still continuing to farm, but with a different dynamic in terms of ownership and control, if you will. So thanks, Claire, for bringing that to the group. Lawrence Ignace has also referred us to the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources in Unama'ki or Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, where they've got some examples as well that people could turn to. Are there other questions from the group that I haven't seen hands raised? I know that Heidi, you've got a couple as well that you wanted to ask, but I want to just check with the crowd before I pop over. Why don't we go ahead with your question, Heidi?
My turn, yay. Miigwech, Jessica, for your outstanding presentation. I've also had a chance to read the intro and the first chapter, and have really enjoyed the book so far. And I think the question that like really stood out for me when I was reading it was, or something I'd love to hear you talk more about, is who you were writing the book for. I really enjoyed your answer today around community engagement and the kind of redistribution of resources, and the ways in which we can like be much more active in the work we're doing with community. But yeah, there was just like, when I was reading your book, there was just so much powerful personal narrative at work that I kept wondering, like, if you saw yourself writing for students coming behind you who, might not also be able to find a lot of space in the academy and are pushing back against their discipline, or if you were like, I really want to tell my dad's story and get this out for my family, or I really want to make this intervention in science. So yeah, if you could just speak a bit to who you were kind of writing for, I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So I think one of the beauties of receiving the contract before the pandemic started was that I decided that, because I was writing during the pandemic, I wanted this to be a healing journey for myself and for others who, obviously sometimes shared or find similarities in the experiences that I shared. And I think that um as an environmental scientist, right, I have been conditioned to um not believe, right, but been told that indigenous knowledges or indigenous science is not necessarily valid because we don't have the data, the numerical data for it to be published. We don't have resources where we can cite our own knowledge, right? Because it's never been tradition for us to peer review our own knowledges and then publish it in, how that academy kind of views itself. And I think that one of the reasons why I wanted to write a book that kind of was tailored towards, younger, to the generation to come of indigenous scientists, was that when I defended my dissertation, my father, instead of congratulating me first, he just told me that with more privilege comes more responsibility. And I think that that's just a teaching that I value a lot, that, if we have privilege, we have the responsibility also to make those decisions to support especially younger, the future generation. And I think that oftentimes we hear the word decolonization a lot, but for me, decolonization means that we have to dismantle all these layers that colonialism embedded in our communities. It's kind of like peeling an onion, right? Where we're going to be crying, where there's going to be emotions. And I think that this book was hopefully tailored for those, indigenous students who were probably thinking of pursuing environmental sciences, but because they didn't see themselves reflected in that field, they probably went, to something else where, and I think that it was also written for many of my community members whose stories are never heard, because oftentimes we're invited to the table, but when we question whether we're actually being listened to, we're not being listened to, right? Our stories are not, we're just reaching that diversity quota, we're not really being respected. And I think that that's why the format of the book doesn't necessarily summarize what they told me. It kind of writes in quotation marks the stories that they share and the testimonies that they share. And I think that as a result of the differences that I wanted to incorporate in the book, I didn't go with university press. I went with, a mainstream press, because, university presses kind of make you write in this academic way. And I wanted to write a book that, anybody could pick up, whether you just love animals and are a non-indigenous person, or whether you, go hard for national parks, but don't really understand their history. So I guess it was a book for me to, heal and also uplift stories. And also, I guess if I were to say who I wrote it for, it's probably the future generations of indigenous scholars that we're going to see, especially going through the academy. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you for that great response. I think you really did achieve that so powerfully. And a number of us who had a chance to talk about the book yesterday had also wondered if that's why you had made the press choice you did. And it's great to hear you talk about the kinds of freedoms that those choices gave you, because I do think sometimes we just continue to follow that kind of well-laden path in the academy. And really reading your book reminded me of like all the ways in which that's such a jarring experience when we first start out, and the ways in which we get kind of disciplined into that. So it was a really powerful reminder to me as well, just to be more thoughtful about the ways in the colonial aspects of the academy. So thank you so much, really powerful. I see Heather Carlos has a question too.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say the same thing. Really appreciated hearing your response and thinking about that and being critical about the way the system currently looks and how we can decenter it, destabilize it, unsettle it. So thank you. Yeah, Carlos Sanchez has a question for you. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I was reflecting on Etuatamug, or two-eyed seeing. Could you speak a little bit to what you see as the potential gifts of bringing together displaced Indigenous knowledges that you talked about with local Indigenous knowledges? And maybe you can speak particularly to the Maya Chorte knowledge with Duwamish knowledge in so-called Seattle.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that that was another reason why I wanted to write this book, is that oftentimes when, you know, I read articles about traditional ecological knowledge, there was no reflection of Indigenous knowledges, especially south of the border, right? And I think that that goes back to how in the United States, our Indigenous indigeneity is not often kind of accepted because of the racial categories, right? We're either labeled as Hispanic or Latinx, but not necessarily Indigenous. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we have lost a lot of Indigenous children at that border, right? Because the immigration policies assume that because we're coming from Latin America, we speak Spanish, but many of our people don't even speak Spanish because that's our colonial language. And that's why, you know, most of the deaths, unfortunately, were preventable deaths that, you know, they weren't able to advocate for themselves because they didn't speak Spanish or English. And I think that one of the things that I see is that, you know, in the entire Americas, we used to kind of share, and I was talking to Dr. Nick Estes recently, where we have historical accounts where we used to share our knowledges, where we used to, you know, not be separated by these settler borders, where there's, you know, data that, you know, there was cacao seeds found in the Dakotas, and, you know, cacao seeds were often, you know, came from Central America. And I think that, you know, we have always shared our knowledges, we have always supported each other, but because there's a part of history that has been fractured and we don't really know the entire history because of colonization, we often forget that, you know, our Indigenous knowledges sometimes share similarities because we used to share the knowledge among each other. And I think that, you know, that's one of the powers, is like we're reclaiming our intertribal relationships, our transnational intertribal relationships, and that allows us to build solidarity and obviously learn from one another, because, you know, we may not know how to care for this tree here that's dying off because, you know, there's climate change impacts that are allowing this parasite to kind of grow and kill the tree. But, you know, other communities might have some experience caretaking for a tree that's kind of, you know, undergoing the same kind of phenomenon because of climate change. And I think that that's the power of sharing our knowledges, especially across borders, because we used to do that. But, you know, once borders were created, it separated our, you know, relationships that we had built. Thank you for your question.
That's a really important point, I think, that you raised, just about these borders that we now can't cross. This was very different than the way things looked, you know, prior to colonization, and the way these political borders now operate. I know Heidi had another question. Do you want to ask that now, Heidi?
Yeah, and it looks like Trisha also had a question that came directly to me. So I'll put these together because they both feed on the conversation we've already been having. So in response to your answer to Carlos's question, one of the things I really loved about the book was your discussion around like the relationship with bananas as a displaced plant that you like understand as a relative. And I'm just wondering if you can speak a bit more to like how this kind of Indigenous notion of understanding displacement. I know you've already talked a bit about the responsibilities it carries for us, but also as Indigenous people, but also the ways it might help us think through responses to like the kind of state we live in with the impacts of settler colonialism. And then Trisha's is a bit different direction, but feeds off the first or that conversation as well, where she was wondering if you had thoughts you could share around, now that you've accomplished your work and have your PhD, despite the obstacles of working in a colonized academy, if you could speak to what advice you would share with students who are coming along behind you, who also want to expand the use of the two-eyed seeing in the academy. And what advice do you have for faculty who seek to support those students?
Yeah, thank you for your questions. And I think that, oftentimes when we have talked to Secretary Deb, especially in the United States, and mentioned to her that, we lost Indigenous children at the border, she was unaware that, there were Indigenous people, so there were Indigenous children. And she kind of, in a way, and other Indigenous leaders have kind of paralleled it with boarding schools, right? Because they often target our Indigenous children where, separating them from their parents is also like a form of genocide, right? Because they're trying to destroy our cultures and get rid of them. And I think that one of the things that's important is to, kind of become more familiar with indigeneity south of the border, especially because oftentimes when we talk to Native American leaders or Indigenous peoples of the United States or Canada, they don't really understand indigeneity from south of the border. So it's harder for us to form those relationships and to form that solidarity that we need sometimes, especially as our children are being separated at the border from their parents. They're being placed in cages. And I think that, that's an important thing, especially for Indigenous solidarities, across the Americas. And the second question, I forgot it.
Yeah, no, the second question was really about like what advice you might have for students coming behind you and like the faculty who want to support them in how to like expand the use of two-eyed seeing, or, I think really also the question that Trisha's wants to raise is like knowing what you've known now and you've, made it through the experience of the academy. What would you love to like to have known or to tell those coming behind you?
I guess that's a hard question, right? Because sometimes I wonder, like, what would be a great advice? And I think that it's allowing students to bring their entire selves, especially in the sciences, right? Because we're often told to remove ourselves or identities, especially in the name of objectivity, where we're like, oh, science is objective. You cannot really express yourself or have any subjective values in it. But I think that with Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledges, we have to bring our spirituality, we have to bring ourselves into those conversations. And I think just making space for that. Obviously, I had a very supportive PhD advisor who kind of supported me in formulating my project that kind of center Indigenous knowledges that obviously had to blend Western science, because in an academy we're still required to blend that Western science to write a dissertation. And I think it's just being open to learning from students as well, practicing that multi-directional learning that, oftentimes we're taught that we know everything once we have a PhD, but we're still learning, right, as we go. And I think that that's an Indigenous principle, that you never stop learning. Even elders say that they never stop learning, that they're still learning. And I think that, just being open to that. And I think that hopefully, that helps students, but obviously there's so many layers that sometimes they need support in, like mental health, economic resources, and things like that. So I think it's a multi-layer question that, hopefully Native or Indigenous organizations are trying to address somehow, but sometimes there's no resources or funding to address those things as well. But thank you for your question, Tricia.
Thanks, Jessica and Tricia. I'm going to just pose a quick question in for myself, if you don't mind. It was one of the slides that you had, you made a reference to needing to have a balancing act between, and if I remember correctly, it was a balancing act between the ecologically noble Indigenous person, and then on the other side, and I'm trying to remember what the other side was, as the counter narrative around science. And my question though is, can you think of some concrete examples? I remember in that first introductory chapter of your book, you talked about how a prominent scientist in a public space mocked you for and called, you know, the science that you were bringing to the conversation as Jessica's theory, and really dismissing you. And you know, there are times where I think we do need to play that sort of diplomatic role, the balancing act that you talk about. But are there other times, like in those instances, where in hindsight, like, are you happy with how it was handled? Are there recommendations for how to call that kind of behavior out, which is really, well, it's white privilege and, you know, white male privilege coming out to play. And it's so disheartening. It's so offensive. Do you have any examples of how you've dealt with it in a way that reminds people of, like, just, you know, how brutal they can be, I suppose, is my question.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes, you know, we don't understand the values of our words. And, you know, when I was writing the book, that's something that came up to mind because, you know, I thought at that incident I had let it go. And I think that oftentimes, you know, those microaggressions actually are traumatic for us because, you know, we say, oh, yeah, we let it go. We're just going to forget that. But clearly, writing the book, it brought it back to the surface. And I think that, you know, as professors, especially in environmental sciences, because, you know, I don't have experience with other fields, we are taught that we kind of have to make our research areas like kind of like a part of our identity. And I think that oftentimes that doesn't allow people to view it as a critique of the field as opposed to a personal critique. And obviously some cases, many people, you know, like even ourselves, right? We're like, oh, we're environmental scientists, we're indigenous scientists. When there's a critique on it, we can take it personal. And I think it's always being humble, being willing to learn, being willing to kind of separate ourselves from these systems, right? That, you know, because there's people in our community who also criticize academia, right? But if we take it personal, then we're failing to recognize their voices, and we're failing to recognize that their critique has some value and have some, you know, have some truth to them. And I think that, you know, it's being able to separate ourselves from the larger systems that play a role in the oppression that our communities still face. And I think with that professor, you know, they probably didn't have experience working with indigenous peoples or indigenous students. And obviously, you know, that's another critique of environmental sciences, marine sciences, where, you know, it's not a diverse field. So sometimes people don't know how to behave or react to certain, you know, other perspectives. And I think that, you know, is that cultural humility that some people need to address and put forward. But I wouldn't know how to, you know, solve the larger issue of how, you know, sometimes how to undo the harm that has been caused, especially against certain indigenous students.
That was brilliantly insightful, Jessica, and I feel humbled by that response, and will maybe help me in reminding myself when I react to things that can be that way. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I see we have Joan, another question from Joan. Go ahead, Joan. You're on mute, Joan.
I was wondering if part of your pursuit, I'm so impressed with what you've written. I really want to, I haven't read the book, but I'm definitely going to get it. That in Mexico, what has happened over the years for century, all the cultural artifacts are given very inappropriate names, such as the Codex Borgias, named after the Borgia family, and also a lot of the presumption of what they meant. You know, they use a lot of Christian analogies to describe the pyramids in different ways, the various temples and pyramids, and give them strength, even to call a codicy after the Vatican, Vaticanus or whatever. You know, I mean, there's also a way of removing the Christian impact on on Indigenous culture. And I was wondering if you get into that.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that brings to light many of even our environments, right? Like in national parks and monuments, we still have certain areas named after people who ended up committing harm against Indigenous peoples, right? And that's something that we can even see in national parks in the United States. And I think, renaming especially our sacred items, our sacred sites is always like a way of also healing, right? Where we can, take away from that religions. I know that in my Maya Chartic communities, even a lot of our land was converted into a national park. It has the name Monte Cristo, right? Which is, referring to Christ. And I think that oftentimes, hopefully the renaming takes place, but obviously it's always a pushback, right? Because many people build a relationship with also the name, so they don't want to rename things, right? We can tie it back to even football teams, how they have, derogatory terms still. And like, it's a big debate on renaming even a football team because, again, people build that kind of relationship that, they feel like they're being personally attacked, when in reality is trying to undo and trying for Indigenous peoples to heal, especially from those impacts, right, that even the names have on them.
Mhm.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands coming up at the moment, but I want to give a final opportunity for anybody in the room to ask a final question. And if not, I might be turning to Barb in just a minute to close our meeting. But again, I just wanted to welcome any last questions for Jessica, if there are any. All right, well, hearing none, I really wish we were together in person, Jessica, so that we could give you a very warm thank you with our applause. So yeah, maybe we could raise our hands up if we have our cameras on, put our applause in the room. I can't wait to read the rest of your book, and knowing, having had this conversation beforehand, or I've started it, but now being able to think of your words, your messages, and hearing your voice is just really going to make the book so much more meaningful, I think, for me anyways. And just wanted to thank you for your responses to everyone's questions today. They were full of insight and richness, and it's so exciting to have another Indigenous scientist with a PhD out there as a role model for all of those Indigenous youth who are going to be following in your footsteps for sure. I think your point about climate science and climate justice are not landing on deaf ears in this room. I think that there's people that people are on side with what you're saying, and I hope to see that grow with a lot of momentum through your book and through the work of many of the people on this call today who are involved in this area. So thank you so much for coming, and to Heidi, thank you for co-hosting with me. To Hector, who's been working behind the scenes in organizing, to Sarah Ann, who's been working behind the scenes with organizing. And now I'd like to maybe pass it over to Barb for the last word of our evening together.
Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you, Dr. Hernandez, for your words. And I would like to thank each and every person here for the respect that they showed in their conversation. And I ask that the words that were shared by Dr. Hernandez and the thoughts that she has given you, that you are able to take those thoughts and in a respectful, wise, and truthful way, that you're able to share them with others, and that you too are able to make this movement forward of understanding of the Indigenous ways of scientific knowledge and caring and concern can move forth, so that each and every person can make that difference, but make it in a manner that is thoughtful, that is humble, that is done in a way that shows the way it needs to be, and that people who are receiving it can understand that the words are shared with love, concern, and desire to ensure that our environments, our world is a safe place for all of our generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barb. And I've just dropped into the chat, everyone, where you can find Jessica's book. I think that's the right place, Jessica. I think there's a couple of different places that you can pick it up. And I think it'll be really worth a read. So again, thanks everyone. That's a wrap. And we look forward to another circle and maybe Impact Chair co-hosted event in the future. Thank you again, Jessica.